Okay, now you're recording.
Good morning. I'm Richard Neutra, president of the Neutra Institute, and uh, I've invited today Professor Volker Welter from the University of California, Santa Barbara, to tell us something about the evolution of my father's famous 1948 Tremaine house. Um, my dad, in his autobiography, muses that at one time architects only had one client, and they worked their entire life on pyramids and castles and so forth for this one client, and that he realized that his more than 200, I think maybe 250 residences that he designed was a phenomenon of transition economically, in which middle class people could hire architects, and that ultimately, as we get to the mega cities, people will be living in apartments. And although he'd gotten nice letters from former residence owners, few apartment dwellers, other than Charles Eames, ever wrote him a fan letter about his apartments, which he also felt very important about. And in his book, he talks about the comédie humaine, the parade of different types of clients, and the fact that spouses were often oppositely attracted, so that any kind of client was really a group client. And Volker, tell us about the Tremaines and their architectural background.
Hello, Raymond, and many thanks for inviting me for this opportunity to speak with you about the Tremaine House. Let me briefly go into screen share and actually call up the presentation or the slides I prepared, and let me go into presentation mode. All right. Well, so to give you the brief background how I actually got onto this project, when I studied architecture back in the 1980s in Berlin, the Tremaine House was a very famous building which sort of in my professor in architectural history talked a lot about. And I remember I was always very, very fascinated living in Berlin, where the sky tends to be gray for most parts of the year, not the entire year. I was always really fascinated by a house which was sort of presented in these slides and flooded with sunlight, and you could easily be on the inside, be on the outside. And I thought, this is just incredible that somebody can design a house somewhere in the world where you can have a completely different climate in a completely different way of living. So once I eventually came to Santa Barbara, it took me still a really long time before I decided to look actually into the history of the Tremaine House. And the initial idea was to actually do an essay or an article, scholarly article, on the Tremaine House Neutra designed. And here we can see the cover of the book, which I published not too long ago, which shows the famous terrace and the a corner of the living room of Neutra's Tremaine House in Montecito in California. There is a second very famous Tremaine house by Oscar Niemeyer, the Brazilian architect. It's the Tremaine Beach House, which was never built, but it was supposed to be built in the Santa Barbara area. And my original idea was I'm going to look into if the Tremaine Beach House and the Tremaine House by Neutra, if this is the same client, and then I can write a nice essay about these two houses. And so when I started looking into this family history and looking at these two commissions, one thing became clear very, very quickly. The Tremaine House by Neutra and the Tremaine Beach House, the unbuilt project by Niemeyer, they were actually for different clients. It was the same family. There were two brothers and their wives, and the one couple commissioned the house from Richard Neutra, and the other couple commissioned the house from Oscar Niemeyer. So that was the beginning of what then spiraled out into not an article, but into an entire book, because it then became clear that among these two couples, they commissioned about 30 modernist designs, mostly for houses from the late 1930s to the mid-1970s. So over a duration of 40 years, these two couples were constantly involved in working with architects Richard Neutra, Frank Lloyd Wright, Philip Johnson, Oscar Niemeyer, and then a whole range of more regional or locally known architect, Luther Maria Riggs and Robert Garland, and so on. So that's just a little bit of the background, how I got onto this project. Here on this slide, I show you a few images of the three Tremaine brothers. Here in the corner, this is Burton Tremaine, who we have here as well, who marries Emily Tremaine. So Burton and Emily is the one Tremaine couple. And then for us, interesting very much for our conversation today, is Warren Tremaine, who marries Catherine or Kit Williams or Williams Tremaine, which we can see here in her youth when she was the Mardi Gras queen in New Orleans. And this is Catherine or Kit Tremaine later in life, here apparently somewhere in Nicaragua, in front of some kind of graphic of one of the leaders of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Now, the Tremaines themselves, the two brothers, there were actually three brothers. There is the brother here in the center, which is Alan Tremaine. He, however, passed away relatively early in his life, so he is not part of the story of the Tremaines as patrons of modern and modernist architecture. So the Tremaine brothers, they came originally from Cleveland in Ohio, where their father was a businessman, an entrepreneur. He was into sort of companies, everything around electric supplies, electricity, household appliances. The father became very early on one of the leading managers of General Electrics. And the Warren and Burton Tremaine and Warren Tremaine, they continued the family business, which was located for various reasons, the business dealing with electricity, with light fittings, lamps, and so on, was in Connecticut, located in Connecticut. That became the main sort of business with which Burton Tremaine was involved. He ran that business for the family, but then the father already of the Tremaines, he branched out into land holdings, into cattle ranching. And so the Tremaines, very early from the 20th century on, they had large holdings in the Arizona area, initially in southern Arizona, closer to Phoenix. And then eventually these land holdings and the cattle ranching moved into northern Arizona, especially the area around the famous Meteor Crater near Winslow in Arizona. The land around that crater is still today in family possession. So Warren Tremaine was mostly in charge or responsible running these cattle ranching and ranching business in Arizona on behalf of the family. Warren Tremaine marries Catherine Williams Tremaine. She came from a New Orleans family. Her father was what is described in a family biography, a lumber baron in the New Orleans area. So she came from a very wealthy background. She was independently wealthy when she married Warren Tremaine. And Burton Tremaine marries Emily Hall. She was a girl or a woman who came from Butte in Montana, where her father was also a very successful businessman. Now, all these, Emily Hall, Catherine Williams, and the Tremaine brothers, they all had various connections to the Santa Barbara, Montecito area. So the families either lived there or were holidaying there. And so they knew this area, they had connections there. And at some point in their youth, they all tended to live at some point in Santa Barbara, mostly in Montecito. And that's where sort of they got to know each other. And out of that connection, then eventually these two marriages are sort of arising. We have then Burton and Emily. They live their life mostly in Connecticut, in New York, with sometimes they are in Montecito. And Warren and Catherine, once they're married, they live in Arizona, but they are always sort of drawn to the Montecito area. And that's where obviously then eventually Neutra designed the Tremaine house.
Now, the commission was not originally his, and that the design went through a whole series of versions, right?
Yes, that was a very interesting sort of insight during the research into Neutra's Tremaine house design. That the house today is firmly associated with Neutra. Neutra did design the building which was built, but the genesis of the house, the genealogy, so to speak, is actually far more complex, and it sort of is deeply rooted in Santa Barbara Montecito architecture. So here we have just a few images. And I tried to pick here very famous photographs by Julius Schulman, and they are famous because these are the images. I very much remember, for example, the lower right images from my own lectures when I was a student of architecture, and also the famous mitered glass corner in one of the bedrooms in the completed Tremaine house. Here is, again, the living room looking out onto the terrace. So this is the indoor view, and this is the outdoor view of the same corner of the house. And then this wonderful black and white photograph, which shows this huge piece of land with these old California oak trees, and how this house is sort of really pushed to the side. It sits on a slightly raised piece of the land, and then sort of this beautiful roof line, how it's stepped down and comes to an end at this particular large tree and on that side of the property. So this is the house which Neutra eventually designs, but as you already mentioned, the commission originally was actually not his, but of a completely different architect. So here we have an aerial view, which thanks to Google Maps and Google Images, I could screen print this. And this shows the red line gives you a rough or an approximate indication of the property that remains. And now I'm talking about Warren and Catherine Tremaine, the property they bought in the early 1940s in Montecito, which is just outside of Santa Barbara. So here is the Casa Tremaine, it says in the maps by Richard Neutra. So this is the house which we are actually talking about today, but the Tremaines owned in total about 37 acres of land. Which is all here. And you can see nowadays the land obviously has been subdivided and many, many houses have been built on this property. So the Tremaine house really sits away from the main road. This was the road from which you access the big property, and the Tremaine house has really been pushed to the far side of that property. So you cannot see the house from the road at all. It is not possible. You can drive by, you will not get a glimpse of the house, and you can barely see the house from any of the surrounding properties because of the mature trees and the vegetations. The house is really sort of tucked away deep inside the initial property. So in August 1944, Warren and Catherine Tremaine actually went to a Santa Barbara architect, Luther Maria Riggs, and she's a very, very well-known local architect in Santa Barbara. She's somewhat known in Southern California, but I don't think she's known much outside of California. She was one of the early architecture students at Berkeley University, and she then was working in Santa Barbara with George Washington Smith, another very good revival style architect in Santa Barbara. And when Smith passes away in the early 1930s, Luther Maria Riggs takes over his office, becomes his successor. And so Warren and Catherine, when they decide that they want to build a house in the Montecito area on this particular piece of land, they go to the architect, which they certainly knew about, Luther Maria Riggs. She was the go-to architect for large houses, for the upper middle classes, the upper classes in the area. If they wanted to have a house for themselves or a house on their estate, then they would usually go to Luther Maria Riggs. So Riggs is the person who starts working on the design. She doesn't work on her own. She works with Lockwood DeForest Jr., who is a local landscape architect. Again, a name which in Southern California, in Santa Barbara, and also maybe in entire California is very, very well known for many, many garden designs. And Lockwood DeForest, he surveyed the land, and Luther Maria Riggs was asked to design the land. Now, Luther Maria Riggs is a Santa Barbara architect, but in 1944, the United States is, for a number of years now, involved in the Second World War. Riggs, during the war, had to close down her Santa Barbara office, and she was actually working in Hollywood, in some Hollywood studios, doing set designs for the movie industry. The Tremaines asked her to design the house in August 44, and then from August till sometime in December 1944, there is lots of correspondence going forth and back. Riggs and Lockwood de Forest, they're surveying the land. They meet with Catherine Tremaine on the building site. And at that point, it was already decided that the house should be located in this part of the entire property, not over here or over there or anywhere else. So this was really a decision which was made by Catherine Tremaine, by Riggs, and by Lockwood de Forest. Catherine Tremaine also figured out, if we put the house on this part of the land, and if we have a terrace which looks out towards the west, and it is a raised terrace, one can actually get a glimpse from the ocean, because this property is about 1.6 miles away from the beachfront or from the oceanfront. So it's inland. It is not an oceanfront property. And there is actually a really interesting document in Luther Maria Riggs' archives, which we have at UC in Santa Barbara. There is a very precise list of rooms which should be in the new building. This list is, however, not dated, and it is not quite clear if Riggs conceived this list, if she actually developed the program of rooms for the house, or what the origin of this document is. But at least it indicates that the basics of the house, the position of the house on the land, some idea about the configuration with that raised western terrace, and probably some of the rooms which were supposed to be in the house, that was all in place before Neutra became involved. Now, the Tremaines, from August to December, they get increasingly impatient that Riggs doesn't produce an initial design, that she doesn't send any sketches. And Riggs always sort of says, you know, I'm trying to do this, but I can only do this on the weekends, can only do this in the evenings. It's quite clear that her work in the film studios is so demanding that she cannot at the same time design a house or work on the house for the Tremaines. And so around the December 1944, Warren and Catherine Tremaine then tell Luther Maria Riggs, I'm afraid we take the commission away from you. We are actually giving this commission to another architect. They initially never tell her who this architect is. It's Lockwood de Forest, who at some point in a letter to Riggs sort of said that the Tremaines were talking about Neutra. And then Lockwood de Forest makes a very interesting comment, sort of where he says that this obviously that they want to have a modernist house, and he, Lockwood de Forest, really can't see a modernist house on this particular piece of land. So one question is we should address, I want to look at a little deeper, is the question, why Luther Maria Riggs? She was a famous architect in Santa Barbara, so she was the go-to architect, but there was also a family connection between, or a link between the Tremaine family and Riggs. And now we have to briefly dig into the history of the other Tremaine couple, of Burton and Emily Tremaine. Now, Burton Tremaine was Emily's third husband, and they married at some point in the early or in the 1940s. Before that, Emily was twice married, and her first husband was a gentleman called Maximilian von Romberg. Very interesting figure. His father was a German nobleman, and his mother was from an American family. And so he grew up in Germany and in California, or in the United States. And so Emily, and here we can see Emily von Romberg, and later in her third marriage, she becomes Emily Tremaine. And here we can see Maximilian, or Max von Romberg, the German-American or American-German. And he also comes from a very wealthy family. And they decide in 1936 that they together want to build a house in Montecito. They also were living in Montecito. And so they ask Max and Emily von Romberg, ask Luther Maria Riggs to design this wonderful von Romberg house in Montecito. which is one of the largest houses, which was built in the later 1930s in Montecito, 36 to 38. It has barely been published because then the events around the National Socialism in Germany, and then in 1939, the Germans starting the Second World War on September 1st, that all prevents this house from getting publicity. But it is an interesting house because Riggs really was forced to design a modern house. The history of this I discuss in depth, obviously, in the book. So when the other Tremaine couple, then 44, after the Second World War has come to an end, at least in Europe, when they then decide to build a house in Montecito, they are not only asking with Riggs, a locally well-known architect, but they are also going to the same architect who designed for the for Burton and Emily Tremaine a house in Montecito before the war. So there was kind of a certain logic in this that, oh yeah, they designed a really nice house for my brother and his wife, or for the wife of my brother and her first husband. So let's also go to Riggs and ask her for the design. So that, I think, is another reason how Riggs initially got the commission before it then was passed on to Neutra. So you asked about the various versions, or you mentioned already the various versions Neutra designs. So here we have some drawings from the archive of your father's and your brother's architectural work at UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles. And we have here the first design, which you can see is January 23. So in December 44, the commission is basically taken away from Riggs and it is officially handed over to Neutra. And Neutra clearly was very keen on this commission. He produces essentially within a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, he produces a complete design for the house, of which I show you here only the floor plan of the main floor of the building. And that's in January 23. And then you can see the next plans here. They are all dated around June 1945. So the Tremaines get the first set of plans. They are looking them over. They are discussing them. And then they ask Neutra to produce various alternatives. And I don't want to get too much into the details of these alternatives, but in the first design, you can see we have a pinwheel sort of floor plan with this is the raised terrace. We have a 5-car garage, which tells you quite a bit about the sort of social and economic standing of the clients. Large living room, bedroom wing, service wing, and then here the entrance area. You can see that these alternative plans, they were all evolving around the idea to produce a smaller house. It is not that the Tremaines didn't have money to build a large house, but the Tremaines, I mean, they were very, very wealthy, but they also had a clear understanding you may own lots of money, but that does not mean that you have to spend all your money. So there is a certain element of thrift. Almost every architect they worked with, they almost asked to also produce smaller versions of the house. So can we have the same amount of space or a different type of house which works equally well, for which we have to spend less money? So you can see here that the idea of a pinwheel floor plan has been given up, and the bedroom wing sort of has been kind of folded over by 90 degrees and sort of strung along the northern facade of the house. And here are various versions of the living room. Here you can see we have a sort of inclined wall. Here we have a straight wall of the living room. Here we have, again, a slightly different configuration. So proposal 3, 3A, and 4, they are kind of more compact ideas of the house, but eventually in mid-June, the Tremaines and Neutra, they decide on proposal 3B, which basically returns to a pinwheel arrangement with significant changes, however, in the center of the house, that this is the basis of the plan as it then was realized, the building. One of the big changes concerns here the living room area. You can see in the original design, we have a very prominent staircase at the center of the house. So the entire pinwheel plan really sort of spins around this centrally located staircase. And we can see here the staircase has disappeared. It has been tucked away here closer to the bedroom wing, so it lost its prominent position, and the living room, or what Neutra called the social quarters, they become the actual sort of idea of the plan. What is interesting about this, that the Tremaines clearly from the beginning were very much engaged in the design process of the house, and they didn't simply tell Neutra, here you have your 44 acres of lands, and this is where you build as the house, but they were really involved and engaged with the house. Initially, I think out of, as I said, this element of thrift, maybe thrift is not quite the right word, of sort of, yeah, not wasting money. Even if you're wealthy, you don't have to waste your money. And then I think over the time, it also became out of aesthetic concerns, because this was a real aesthetic learning process for Warren and Catherine Tremaine to build up the house. Do you want me to continue, or?
So one of the big changes was at the a upper level that had been designed that was ultimately eliminated with all kinds of consequences.
Yes, I mean, this goes back to, as I pointed already out, this question of the staircase. So we obviously, if we have a staircase in the house, we need a, clearly it has to go to some either upper or lower level. And as I said here, I only show the lower level or ground floor or first floor level of the house in the way in which California counts floor levels. So I can show you here some early photographs of a model which Neutra produced of the house. This model doesn't seem to exist anymore, but it does survive in some photographs. And we can see here clearly that the house was designed with 2 stories or 2 levels. There is the lower level, the main level of the house, and then there is an upper level of the house, which we can see here with 2 walls which are encased with glass. And here from the other direction, there is a fireplace area, a chimney with a here black rectangle with an open fireplace. So there's obviously an outdoor sitting area. And here is a bird's eye view of this model, where we can also clearly see that there was quite a large roof sitting on top of the building. So the building was initially conceived to have 2 stories, which is very important for the design of the building, which had tremendous consequences for the house as it was built, because most people will know it, and you may have seen it in the earlier images. It is a 1-story building. So the 2nd story was never built. The division of spaces was very clear, that the upper level story of the building was reserved for the master suite or the master bedroom. There was a bedroom there, a bathroom, dressing rooms, and there was a small space for Catherine Tremaine, where she had sort of her own private space, almost like a boudoir in an old-fashioned sense. And then there was an outdoor terrace anchored by this open outdoor fireplace. And then this model shows something else very nicely, to which I will get much later in our conversation. There was a swimming pond at the house, not a swimming pool, but a swimming pond. So we can see here, and here you can see an edge of the pond. Here in the model, you can see a larger edge of the pond. So it was an irregular shaped or organically shaped sort of pond near the house for swimming. And the idea was to actually put an artificial beach around this pond. And I pointed out earlier that the building site is about 1.6 miles or almost 2.5 kilometers away from the ocean front. And so the idea that you have a pond and you have a beach at your own house, so you can actually live there, have the beach life, Southern California beach life, without actually being at the ocean. So just laying out here the thread with the pond, because we will get back to this later on. So this was the house as it was conceived, as it was approved by the Tremaines, with the 2 stories and with the swimming pond next to the house. And if we then look at the floor plan of the house as it was built, then we do have the stair to the upper level, but the upper level in the end was never built. We do have the floor plan, the pinwheel floor plan, with the very prominently located, what Neutra calls the social quarters, what we would call in more traditional language, the living room, with a small library and file storage, or a safe room, a fire safe room. This is Southern California, so we do have often wildfires. We have the main entrance into the house from the southern side, with a guest room suite, or at some point one of the children of the Tremaine were living there. Then the entrance passage, the social quarters, with the dining room on the other side. Behind the dining room, we have the service wing with pantry, kitchen, sitting room, and then maids areas, a humongous storage space for trunks. And the garage is no longer exactly a 5-car garage. It has shrunk a little bit, but it's still a substantially large garage. Again, sort of an indication of the sort of socioeconomic potential or level the clients live on. Then here we have the staircase to the upper level, a staircase. There is a small basement below the house. And then here we have the bedroom wing with 2 children's rooms. And then now here is the master bedroom suite is at the end of the bedroom wing. So that is important because it was no longer the master bedroom on the upper level of the house. Here is this raised west terrace, which Catherine Tremaine conceived. And once again, it was raised because then you get a glimpse of the ocean with outdoor terraces in front of them. And then here is where Neutra eventually settled for the swimming pool, a rectangular swimming pool, which he designed, but which the Tremaines never built, at least not initially, according to Neutra's design. So that's why I call this plan almost as built in 1948, because of these significant changes. It was about 5,400 square feet, the house, the entire building. That's a rough estimate, which sort of gives us an indication of the size of that actual building. This is the floor plan which Neutra usually publishes, which is very interesting. This is actually an image I took from one of his books, Life in Human Habitat, which he publishes in 1956, when the house was almost completed, almost like 8 or 9 years ago. And so he always publishes this floor plan, which does show this stair to the upper level. And in most books, which Neutra at least published, or for which he sort of had control what images go into the book, he always includes the swimming pool. He never, ever really says that the swimming pool was never built. So that gives you an indication that the swimming pool was really an important part of the architecture as he conceived for the house. And even in more recent books on Neutra, on which illustrate the Tremaine house, we usually find the floor plan with that swimming pool, and again, mostly without any indication that the swimming pool wasn't built. So that now.
So tell us a little bit more about what happened with the bedrooms as they shrunk the house, and what the consequences.
Shrunk the house is a good sort of a good indication. I mean, ultimately, from the archival point of view, we do not know why the house was shrunk. There is a gap in the documentation, and even though I spent years and years on researching this, I at least was never able to find that one document, that one letter, which tells us that we don't want the upper level because we ran out of money, or we don't want the upper level because we think we have enough room on the lower level. So this one document, which as a historian one always hopes for, that doesn't exist. But we do have sort of some indicators what may have happened. I want to briefly sort of speak for a moment a little longer about this upper level, because I think it's actually really important. that the house, for us to understand why this upper level was initially there. And this is a brief comparison between the von Romberg house. This was the house which Luther Maria Riggs designed earlier for Emily von Romberg. And once again, she became, in her third marriage, Emily Tremaine, when she married Burton Tremaine. Burton, the brother of Warren. And we can see certain similarities in these houses. I mean, they're somewhat superficial, but they are important. The von Romberg house has a pinwheel floor plan. This is the service wing here, but this is the main living area. And we have a pinwheel floor plan, and we have a pinwheel floor plan in the Tremaine house by Neutra. And then the von Romberg house has on the third floor, it's a 3-story building. On the third floor, it has a really, really interesting rooftop studio. And this was a small studio with a sun terrace, which was specifically dedicated as a space for Emily von Romberg, later Emily Tremaine. So she actually had her own rooftop house, her own rooftop studio, and it was also the most modern room in this entire house, with the steel framed window, which David Gebhardt, the well-known architectural historian from UC Santa Barbara, at some point describes as a version of Le Corbusier's studio buildings in Paris in the 1920s. And so I think the Neutra's Tremaine house design in a certain way corresponds or is in a conversation with the von Romberg house. So the second story on this building was not just a second story because it would make it more convenient or easier. And I mentioned already this second story also had a small boudoir space for Catherine Tremaine. And so there is this importance of the second story, not just offering more space, but also offering a dedicated space for the woman of the house, the lady of the house, who we're talking here 1940s, 1950s. At that time, the women, of course, were far more expected to be at home, to take care of the kids, to sort of take care of the domestic sort of arrangements and economics, whereas the husbands obviously were the ones who may have gone out to do business deals and things like that. And so we have this idea that in these houses, in these large houses, you need a dedicated space for the women. To dig a little deeper into this, why this second story of the Tremaine house is so fascinating is it's not only that it corresponds here, we have a different view of the von Romberg house, and we can see the studio space really crowns the house. It is sort of like as if the whole house only exists in order to carry that little studio space on top. And here again, the model of the 2-story Tremaine house. And here we have an earlier version of the floor plan of this upper level, where we can see here the master bedroom with the bathroom, with the closet spaces and the storage and the dressing room areas. And then we can see there is this small, here is partially a seating area for Catherine Tremaine. There is a day bed on the outer deck, which with a small daybed or couch, where one can imagine that's where Catherine Tremaine may have sort of reclined during the day, doing some reading or taking a nap or something. And then here we have the actual roof terrace. And this is why I'm showing this little drawing. Neutra calls this roof terrace and the upper level, he calls it a gloriette. And that word is actually really interesting because the gloriette is a word which refers right back to Central European or Viennese palace architecture and the architecture of the European nobility. Neutra, being born in Vienna and having grown up in Vienna, is of course familiar with the Schönbrunn Palace, that huge 18th century palace complex on the edge of Vienna. And in the gardens of Schönbrunn, we have the probably most famous gloriette, which exists at least in European architecture. And that's the one which Hetzendorf von Hohenberg, the architect, designs at Schönbrunn Palace. And we can see here the gloriette is a relatively light building with huge fenestrations, and it sits actually on a raised piece of land within the palace grounds. And the gloriette had two functions. The one function was that it was a pavilion which offered you a beautiful view. Sometimes it's also called the belvedere, the beautiful view. And the view you would take in from this gloriette or from the belvedere, which is on a higher ground, is the view of your own property. So you could basically sort of show this is all mine. And of course, if you are an emperor of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, then you obviously have quite a bit of property to sort of show. The other meaning or the other importance of these buildings is this. I have to briefly refer to the German language. They have an interesting word for these gloriets. They call them Lustpavillon, or pavilion of lust. And that indicates that these were also the buildings where you could take your mistress or your mistresses to, if you wanted to have an evening, an intimate evening with so to speak, with one of your mistresses, or a woman whom you were not necessarily married with. So what I find first very interesting is then when Neutra designs for a very wealthy upper middle class, upper class American or Californian family, he resorts apparently to a vocabulary which evokes these sort of noblemen's buildings in Central Europe. He calls it gloriette, but the gloriette on the Tremaine house still is a space which is also dedicated to Catherine Tremaine. So the origin of this upper level, I think, really goes back to the rooftop studio on the Von Romberg house. But there is also then a way forward from the Tremaine house, because the word gloriette today we associate with the Kaufmann house, which Neutra designs from 45 to 46 in Palm Springs, California, for the Kaufmann family, for whom Frank Lloyd Wright had designed much a decade earlier, the famous Falling Water house, which is the house built on top of a waterfall. And now this gloriette here in Palm Springs, of course, that is now just an outdoor upper space, upper level living room where you walk up these stairs, and then it is essentially a roof with some kind of movable louvers towards the mountainside to control the wind. It has an outdoor fireplace, and it's essentially, one would describe this nowadays maybe as a lounge area. It's a deep roof, it's a shaded area to sit and enjoy the building. So Neutra's gloriette, which we know today is the Palm Springs one at the Kaufmann house, but the Tremaine house was designed before the Kaufmann house, and while he was working on the Tremaine house design, he also received the commission for the Kaufmann house, but the Tremaine's house had this long gestation period. It was only completed in 48, whereas the Kaufmann house was completed essentially within a little over a year. So that's, we're associating the gloriette with the Kaufmann house, but historically speaking, the gloriette actually originates as a type of space in Neutra's houses for the very wealthy clients he had. It originates in the Tremaine house design. Now, coming to those changes which were imposed on the design once the decision was made, the upper story will not be built. And once again, I do not ultimately know why the upper story wasn't built, but we do have some indications. As I mentioned early on in our conversation, Warren Tremaine was in charge of the cattle ranching business, mostly in Arizona. And so Warren and Catherine at some point lived in Arizona. They lived in the Phoenix area. And then they decided they want to live in Montecito. That's when they acquired the land, and they got Maria Riggs and later Neutra to work on the commission. Throughout the building period from 44 or from 45 with Neutra's design to 48, the Tremaines always had sort of conversation among each other. Do we really want to live in Montecito, or do we actually want to live in Arizona? Warren was at some point very much attached of living back in Arizona. Also, there was the family business there, and he was in charge of that part of the family business. And so I believe the most likely reason is that at some point the Tremaines decided, actually, we do want to be living back in Arizona. We want to have this house in Montecito, but we also actually want to have a property in Arizona so that maybe we can live in both places. And so that's, I think, is the most likely reason that relatively late in the design and building process of this house, a decision was made, apparently a very sudden decision. We are not building the second story. We are not building the swimming pool. We will not have a fireplace in the living room. And these are three essential elements which were removed from the original design. I'm saying relatively late in the construction process because the staircase, here again is the stair into the upper level, and here it is in the floor plan as built. The staircase actually existed and still exists in the Tremaine house today. So the staircase was actually built, and then, however, the second roof was never built, as were the other elements. The second reason why we presume that has something to do with the move back to Arizona. Once the house was completed in 48, Warren and Catherine lived in the building for not quite 2 years, around 2 years. And in late 1950, they are already back in Arizona. In August 1948, they have the opening, the housewarming party. And in December 1950, latest in December 1950, they are living back in Arizona. And when they are back in Arizona in the Phoenix area, they immediately asked Neutra to design them a house in Phoenix, Arizona. So they did not leave this Montecito house without the second story because they had a fallout with the architect, but there was clearly a family, a decision internal to this couple, to the family was made that the Montecito house should be completed in a smaller scale, and then they could build another Neutra house in Arizona. So what happened then with the master bedroom suite? That is obviously the interesting question. Now, those of us who are very sort of into mid-20th century modernism in California or in the United States, we most likely know of Neutra's Tremaine house through the bedroom with this world famous mitered glass corner. This is a photograph by Julius Schulman, seen the mitered glass corner from the outside. And then here we have a color photograph also by Schulman looking into the mitered glass corner from the inside. And obviously the photograph is so carefully positioned and photographed that you cannot even see those mitered glass corner. You can figure out that it has to be somewhere up here where these two sort of pieces where the wall comes together in this corner. So somewhere up here obviously is our mitered glass corner somewhere in, but you can see the view. It's very nice. There is this oak tree right outside of the glass, and you just look into the northern part of the property, which sort of just gives you this idea. It's just you and the house, and there is nothing else. You don't see any neighboring building or anything like that. So this particular corner in the house is here on the northernmost edge of the bedroom wing. So the bedroom wing points north, and here in this corner, we then have precisely here is the mitered glass corner, which obviously sits above the actual wall. So it's not a floor to ceiling window, but it's sort of a little below hip height, and then it reaches up to the ceiling. So here's the parents' bedroom, here is the parents' bathroom, and then here is a small sitting area, again with a day bed. So this is now the dedicated space for Catherine Tremaine, her boudoir, and this but this arrangement here was a change in the plans, which was made very, very late into the construction process. Here again, I show you a detail of the plan as the house was conceived in, in 45, in June 45, the proposal 3B. And you can see here, there is one bedroom with two beds, and it calls Diane's room. That was for one of the daughters of the Tremaines. And here it says for little sister. This is for the other daughter with an intermediate bathroom. And then here is a room for a nurse who was supposed to live here with her own little bathroom over here. And then you see in front of these bedrooms, there was this long area, which was called a play porch for the children, which was encased with glass walls, and then it immediately access to the garden or the outside area. And when the decision was made that the upper level master suite, master bedroom, will not be on the upper level. Neutra then put the master bedroom for the parents at the end of the bedroom wing. Here we have one children's bedroom, a second children's bedroom with the additional bathroom here located at the same place. And then the nurse's room obviously was removed. So the nurse was no longer a live-in nurse, but had to live somewhere else in the house. So I find this very fascinating that the one image, which probably most of us know of the Tremaine house by Neutra, this famous mitered glass corner, that was a decision which was entirely driven apparently by the clients who told Neutra, we are not building the upper level. And then Neutra was forced to find space for the master bedroom, and he did find it obviously in the bedroom wing, and he then had to make the play porch a much smaller area for the children to play, and then he had to recreate some kind of visual interest. So on the upper level, one would have had a wonderful view over the entire property of the Tremaines, the meadow right next to the house and the oak trees in the distance. And now, so they had this view of over their property as one would expect from a gloriette. And now he had to recreate a visual, interesting, captivating view without being able to give an overview. So on the upper level, he gives an overview in the design, and now putting this onto the lower level, he gives this kind of zoom-in view, which zooms in onto the details. So it's almost like a sort of a microscopic view. You are immediately, so to speak, living in or looking out into the dense vegetation, the old ancient oak trees. So Neutra, I think he did, this is a masterpiece, this room. It's an absolute wonderful space. But it is interesting that this was born out of necessity, out of a wish of the clients, and then Neutra, rather than giving up at this moment and just putting a bedroom there, he then turns it over and turns it into this absolutely fascinating detail with the mitered glass corner. And thus he creates sort of this image, which now sort of creates for us the idea of this as the Tremaine house. There are other important changes which come through the Tremaines living or experiencing the house initially, and then sort of later being away and then moving back into the house. One of the ideas we have about this Tremaine house from much of the literature, people writing and talking about the house, is that it is climatically absolutely suited to its site. And one of the idea was that the house should be constructed so that it will withstand a fire. Thus the concrete sort of framework, the concrete roofs of the house. So the house was really conceived with the idea if a fire sweeps over the property, much of the structure hopefully will survive. There is lots of interesting ways of cross-ventilating the house, even if you keep these floor-to-ceiling glass sheets closed. You have these little windows, clear-story windows up here, which you can keep open. You can open them in different parts of the house, so you can create a cross-ventilation sort of entering the house and hopefully taking some of the warmth or the heat out of the house. And then here we have this famous west terrace, the raised terrace from which you get an ocean view, and that terrace starts right outside the living room. So this is the main living room area with the library in the background, and then these floor-to-ceiling windows. And you can see originally in 1948, the only sunshade we have at this area is obviously the roof overhang, and it's really a deep roof overhang, so that gives you a decent amount of shading, and then curtains on the inside. There is another photograph from 1948 which shows very interestingly a movable screen standing on the west terrace, and this is one of these screens, this curved wooden screen here, which you can just lift up and place on different parts of the terrace. And this, I think, clearly was a means to keep out the sun when it is low in the sky. It's a western terrace. Sort of when it's lower in the sky, from either flooding too much light into the living room or from even heating up the living room too much in case that you don't keep those doors open all day. So it's like a big sort of solarium passive solar heat gain you will have with these huge glass windows. And then we have more,
Volker,
yeah.
let me just ask you a question here. This structural system was one that my father developed in the early 40s in Puerto Rico for
Mhm.
health centers. And I think that I can't find another example in modern architecture before the 1942 designs with this particular look to it. The closest thing is the Zonnestrahl Sanitarium in Holland, but they
Mhm.
don't have that uh, the beam sitting on another cross beam and that possibility of cross ventilation. Am I wrong about that? Are there other examples of this?
I mean, you're certainly right that this, I mean, Neutra does take the his experience from building in Puerto Rico and in the distinct climate in Puerto Rico. He obviously translates this or transposes this to the Montecito side. And so I think he is aware of the amount of heat and the sun sort of burning or shining down onto this meadow in this particular piece of land, that you have to take this into account. And that's the wide roof overhangs. That's the use of the clear story windows. And you're right. I mean, there are other architects obviously thinking about building climatically appropriate for Southern California locations. But I'm not sure if there is no other house, but I also think, I mean, nothing immediately comes to mind which takes sort of this idea of trying to shade the house and also translating this into this very clear sort of structural logic, which makes visible these distinct elements. But as I said, the other reason for taking this concrete frame structure and then the concrete roof was the fire resistance. And that was something which the Tremaines were very much concerned with, that they wanted that. And so again, I think there is a happy coincidence here that the Tremaines wanted certain materials in order to resist the fire. And Neutra obviously sort of was thinking about this kind of construction and this kind of look in order to deal with the climatic conditions on the site. I think he does something very similar when he designs the one large building he did in Cuba. I think it's a residence nowadays for an ambassador or something, and that has a somewhat similar look. And one would expect that there also there was a strong climatic concern to deal with this. But I mean, even if you are aware of, and Neutra clearly was aware of the climatic conditions, and that's the cross ventilation in the house. The many, also from a passive solar energy viewpoint, the amount of what we call thermal mass in this building, terrazzo floors, concrete frame. And I mean, these are all sort of ways in which you could passively store heat gain you have in such a building. But Neutra apparently, I think, did not quite take into account that you still have moments where you obviously need to shade this Western glass facade. Especially when the evening sun sets and you're using the living room, maybe watching TV or something in the room. And then obviously it was not necessarily enough just to have the curtains. And so in mid-1950, he then installs these vertical redwood louvers, which move around their vertical axis. So you can leave them either this way or you can close them, and you have then this redwood wall essentially in front of this big glass window. And again, that is something which I'm pretty sure the Tremaines asked him to do because they may have realized that the curtains are just not enough. Then they try this movable screen, and then eventually they ask for a permanent solution, which was installed in the middle, around the middle of the year 1950, as we know from a letter where Neutra asked them if they are really happy now with these redwood louvers in front of the glass windows. It's quite interesting how this sort of does then change also the aesthetic of the house. Again, the photograph with these louvers is one of the famous images of the Tremaine house. I mean, Julius Schulman time and again photographed these louvers, and they are quite impressive, especially when you stand next to them. They are not massive pieces of redwood. They are very finely crafted out of thin individual redwood elements, which are sort of stacked vertically and then connected with each other. But it does change the aesthetic of the house because Neutra then installs obviously an I-beam fixed horizontally underneath those protruding roof beams. And this he runs this I-beam through the entire length of this facade so that it doesn't give the absolute impression that this kind of is an afterthought. But again, this famous element, which we know from so many photographs in the end, is a late addition to the house once the clients were obviously living in the house, at least for a while into 1950, and then gathered apparently the experience that climatically, or that there is an issue occasionally with sunlight penetration and potentially with heat penetration. It's quite interesting that the louvers, I mean, they cover the lower floor to ceiling windows. And you can see that the upper clerestory windows, they are not covered by the louvers. So even if you were to close the louvers to constitute temporarily a closed redwood sort of screen in front of your windows, you would still have the benefit of potential cross ventilation if you were to open. I think the middle two are the ones one can open in each of these fields. So you get still cross ventilation into the house. So it's a very carefully sort of late addition to the house in order to deal better with some of the sunlight penetration. And I think it's really sort of, yeah, gives another famous image of this particular building. There were other important changes when the decision was made not to build the upper level story. And the next big change is that the Tremaine house has no open fireplace. And that, I think, is really puzzling because fireplaces seem to me in sort of larger fireplaces in California houses, they seem to be a key ingredient of a mid-20th century house and even earlier house, and even still today. This idea that you can effortlessly live on the indoors, the outdoors, and then you have a fireplace somewhere which gives you some additional warmth even in the cooler evening hours. Or, for example, the house which Neutra's colleague from Vienna, Rudolf Schindler, built for himself in North Kings Road in today West Hollywood, had indoor fireplaces, outdoor fireplaces, so that you could have these additional heat source. And we know from that Neutra, again, he designed a fireplace for the house. Here we have a view of the indoor living room. Here again is the Western Terrace, where in mid-1950, these louvers appear on the outside. And here you can see the sort of footprint of this fireplace. You come from the entrance passage, you enter the living room area, and right to the left, you have your fireplace. Here's a different drawing. This is the main entrance into the house. This is the entrance passageway. Here is now the famous steel column where sort of marks the end of the entrance passage. And that's where suddenly this living room opens up in you as if you are entering a clearing in a forest, and suddenly you look over the entire living room or social quarters. And again, Neutra indicates here would be a good place to have an open fireplace, and then here the chimney stack moving upwards. And that's where above then also would the chimney continue for the outdoor fireplace on the second story. So the fireplace was never implemented, to the best of my knowledge. There was not even yet had begun to be implemented. There are no traces one can see on the floor, anything that there was once a fireplace. So the fireplace clearly became, so to fell victim, so to speak, to the decision not to have the upper level of the house. Instead, Neutra then puts in the place of the fireplace a very beautiful wood paneled wall, which separates this part from the living room from the library space behind it. And then here in this corner on the other side of the wooden wall, there was a fire-safe room, like a file storage room with thick concrete walls where you could store important documents in case of a wildfire running over the house. And then in front of this wooden wall, Neutra places this day bed, which are essentially sort of individual chairs put against the wall. And then you have these sort of individual cubes in front of it, which you can either all move together into a daybed, or you can disassemble this, and you have sort of 4 or 8 additional seating opportunities. So the fireplace as the place where the family could assemble around, although the fireplace being right here next to the end of the entrance passageway doesn't necessarily suggest that this would be a good place where the family could assemble around the fireplace, as Frank Lloyd Wright may have done this. But now Neutra here clearly places this daybed, a large daybed, where the family and the kids, you can just imagine them all lounging on this daybed and hanging out there and having fun as a family on this place. So Neutra does provide there a real interesting sort of social piece of furniture, which really sort of brings people together on this daybed. Whereas the fireplace, I think, in this case, sort of is a fireplace, but it almost appears to me it's more like a decorative fireplace than necessarily one which would have allowed the family to assemble around it. It reminds me of the fireplace in the Kaufmann house, where one also has the impression the fireplace is not the focus of the living room in the Kaufmann house. In case of the Tremaine house, of course, we do have this terrazzo floor, and then there was underfloor heating. So there was not automatically a necessity to have a fireplace as a source of heating of this social space or the living room area. So that's another sort of change which comes from the idea of, as a consequence of not building the second story onto this onto the house. Very briefly, the staircase. This on the upper left here is one of the only, or very few, I think it's actually the only drawing, at least the only drawing I have seen in the archives of Richard and Dion Neutra papers at UCLA. And here is the floor plan. So the view here in this little sketch is here you see where it says play, and we are basically looking from there down that corridor towards the staircase. And you can see here the staircase goes up to the left, which would have then led to the upper level of the house. Behind the staircase, we then have the dining area with the dividing wall. So there's a freestanding wall against an element of wood behind which the dining area is located. And here we have a photograph by Futagawa, which was taken at some point around the late 1960s or very early 1970s. And this is after the Tremaines had refreshed the interior of the house. They had changed the color schemes. They made everything more lighter looking. And at that time, they decided to open up the corner where the staircase was. When Neutra, when the second story wasn't built, Neutra encased this staircase with a plywood wall and a sliding door, so there was a certain storage space behind it. And at that point in the later 60s, the Tremaines decided to open up the area and to create this artificial rock garden with some larger steps where you can sort of put plants on display. And you can see that light is coming into the stairwell from above. So there may have been a skylight since Neutra started constructing the house, or maybe the Tremaines at a later point installed the skylight. So even so this staircase clearly was in the house. It is very interesting that Julius Schulman, who photographed this house over and over again from every possible corner, never took a photograph similar to the view here in Futagawa's photograph, where he would have had to show the place where the staircase actually was. And I'm pretty sure that Neutra, who we know always very carefully instructed or photographers how to photograph his houses, that Neutra probably sort of arranged with Schulman not to take this particular photograph. I've only found one photograph of this particular staircase, and that's a photograph by a German Jewish photographer, Bloch, who fled during the Nazi period from Germany to California. And he, Fritz Bloch, he actually photographed precisely the same view in Futagawa's image, and that's where you can see the plywood encasement of this particular staircase. That photograph is reproduced in the book. Unfortunately, I don't have permission or the rights to show this photograph in this presentation. But it's interesting that Schulman never photographed that one corner, which must have felt to Neutra sort of really, I don't know what Neutra would have felt about this staircase to nowhere. This must have been a constant reminder to Neutra that ultimately the house was never built as he designed it. I don't think this is necessarily a loss for architectural history, because I think what Neutra then did with the compromise solutions, with relocating the master bedroom, he managed to sort of turn this disappointment about not building the second story, I think really forced him to turn this house into this masterpiece, which it is today. But there was always this is sort of like a thorn in your flesh, always this one corner in the house. Whenever you walk past this corner, you sort of think, there it is, the staircase to nowhere, at least to nowhere, because my second story was never realized.
And there were disappointments with regard to the pool also, right?
Yes, I think that's the other big disappointment is that swimming pool. And here, just a brief reminder, this is the model of the two-story building where we had the swimming pond, which I think actually is a real shame that that wasn't built, because I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition of a strictly geometrical house, sort of rectangular building, and then this organically shaped pond with the artificial beach. And then here we have a model of the one-story building with the raised west terrace. So this is the terrace where later the redwood sunshades were installed, and you can see them here in the model. They are already in place. And then here was the pool supposed to be. It was supposed to be a rectangular pool running parallel to the west terrace. And then the west terrace underneath was left open. So that was the kind of pool lounge where you could sit in the shade of the terrace above you. There were some built-ins. There was a bathroom built and toilets, changing rooms, but otherwise it was left open. And here we have a photograph by Schulman which shows the situation with no swimming pool. The lawn just continues. You can see here the stairs coming down from the upper level. You see this photograph again is taken early. There are no redwood sunshades as yet on this window wall, but there is the lawn and there is no swimming pool. Interestingly, when Neutra then publishes floor plans of the house, especially the plan I showed earlier in our conversation, he always draws the rectangular swimming pool next to the west terrace, indicating how important it is for him. And then when he publishes his books, like the collected works of Neutra in the 50s and 60s, he mostly includes this particular photograph of a model where he put a piece of mirror here into the position of the swimming pool. Here, the swimming pool is not rectangular, it's a trapezoid form. But the swimming pool was really important for Neutra. Once it was no longer a swimming pond, but it became a swimming pool. The pool actually became part of the architecture of the house because Neutra wanted that swimming pool to reflect the house, so that you always had the reflection of the house in the pool. Now here on the right-hand side, I just show you one image. This is the swimming pool which today exists at the Tremaine house. It is near the Western Terrace. Here we are on the upper level of the Western Terrace, but you can see it's not parallel to the Western Terrace. It is much further out, and it is in an oblique angle to the Western Terrace. It's a very beautiful design by Robert Garland Jr., a wonderful, extremely gifted Santa Barbara architect who left many, many buildings in the Montecito, Santa Barbara area, buildings which are today more or less unknown and I think completely undervalued. It's beautiful raw exposed concrete. There's a gorgeous pool house, this triangular space. It's more like a pool pavilion, which sort of gives you a little shaded area because you also have, of course, a changing room and toilets underneath the West Terrace. So today we have a swimming pool, but because this house was for many, many decades inaccessible. Even in the very recent literature on the Tremaine house or the collected works of Neutra, we usually find floor plans with that rectangular swimming pool, which Neutra wanted, but which the Tremaines didn't build. So Garland swimming pool was built sometime around the 1968. The documentary evidence is not quite clear if it was 66 or 68, but it was somewhere in the later 60s that finally a swimming pool was built, which then was also used to display artworks. Here we have a beautiful fountain by Oliver Andrews, who was a Los Angeles-based sculptor, and there are other artworks integrated into the surrounds of the pool, into the gates, and the sort of to separate the pool or to enclose the pool for safety reason. One other really interesting detail, which is another little change, which is very little known. The terrace here was initially raised, and underneath it was open as a pool lounge. And when the Tremaines, and I have to look here at some notes I made in the archives, when the Tremaines lived in the house from 48 to some point in 1950s, and then they moved back to Arizona, and they came back to Montecito at some point in 1954. So they were for about 4 years away from Montecito, more or less. And then in 54, they made a decision, we're actually moving back to Montecito. And then they occupied the house permanently until to the later 1960s, when Warren and Catherine Tremaine divorced and both moved out from the house. When they came back around 1954, they made one other really important change. They enclosed the open pool lounge. So there was no pool, and with no pool, there was no need to have an open pool lounge. And so they actually enclosed these spaces with floor-to-ceiling glass windows. And so they had an additional room down there with its own bathroom, because there was already a bathroom and everything was, and there was like a little bar area. I mean, it was already planned as if it would be an open pool lounge. And this is really, really wonderful. There's a letter in the Neutra archives at UCLA, where Neutra writes to Catherine Tremaine and sort of saying that he thanks Catherine Tremaine for a wonderful lunch. So he obviously was at the Tremaine house. And then he writes, I was happy to see in your enlarged living space the new room between the upper and lower garden. So that was obviously the first time that Neutra saw that the Tremaines had made a change to the house, which they did not consult him on. They enclosed that open pool lounge area. And then he writes, so Neutra congratulates her. He calls it a new room, a new living room, or a enlarged living space between upper and lower garden. So the upper garden is here, and then on the other side, the terrain drops a little more, and there is the lower garden. And then he actually writes something which I find very fascinating. Tell me, he writes to Catherine Tremaine, whether a plant pot to stand on the floor would trouble you in the room or in the porch. I would love to hunt up one and present it to you and Warren with your heartfelt wishes. So Neutra, which I think is really interesting, he's very complimentary about this new room. And at the same time, I think his wish to find a plant pot and to gift this pot to Catherine and Warren Tremaine, to put into the room, or maybe to put on the little porch area in front of the room, sort of is really his mark of approval. Even though he wasn't consulted in enclosing this room, he obviously, by donating or by indicating that he would love to give them a nice object for this room, he sort of gives his mark of approval to this change, to this house. And I think this is a really interesting, tiny little detail in the correspondence, which shows how much sort of Neutra cared for the design. But also how much Neutra obviously understood that once a house is completed and once somebody lives in the house, that he has to be very pragmatic about changes to the house. and that he sort of that things may happen to a design, and all he can do is he can then donate a plant pot or a nice planter, and then sort of indicating his agreement or his approval of this change. So those are some of the bigger changes which happened to the house. And as I said, one could consider this house as being incomplete, unvollendet, which would be a nice reference to the Unvollendete from Beethoven, for example. But I think one should rather sort of say that the house was never built as planned and as intended. But what was built instead, I think, is sort of a house in its own right, where except for that staircase, that obviously is the constant reminder, the staircase, and of course the archival documentation we have of the never built second story.
Now, the Kit Tremaine then, after the divorce, had another house, which you have some interesting thoughts about.
Yes, coming a little bit to the final two slides of this of the presentation I made for our conversation. So the Tremaines, Warren and Catherine Tremaine, they are entering a very difficult period in their marriage in the later 1960s. And it begins much earlier when they moved back to Montecito in 54. Dionne Neutra, she became really good friend with Catherine and Warren Neutra as well. And she writes to Catherine Tremaine how wonderful she thinks that they're moving back to Montecito, and that it's really nice to have them back in, so to speak, in their neighborhood, and that they can see more often and so on. And she makes some really interesting suggestions. She said, maybe you could become involved in a local charity or something like that, because the reason for these recommendations Dionne Neutra is making is a remark Catherine Tremaine made in an earlier letter, where she writes to Dionne Neutra and says that Warren is really champing the bits of moving back to Montecito. Catherine, however, when they had taken up life in Arizona again, she had opened her own business. She had a children's store for children's clothing and toys, together with some other lady. And she really enjoyed apparently running her own business. And she was extremely apprehensive to have to close down her business because her husband wants to move back to Montecito. And she says at some point in this letter, I really don't want to go back to a life of where Warren asks me every morning, what would you like to do today, darling? And that's, however, is the life which she then took up again when in 54, the couple and the children moved back to Montecito. So that, I think, is the kernel or the germ of some disagreement in how do you want to live in Montecito with obviously the financial background the couple had, both members of the couple independently and of course as a couple earned as members of the larger Tremaine family. So in the later 1960s, the Tremaines eventually divorced. By that time, they had built another house. They had a wonderful house by Cliff May built outside of Dublin. There's a beautiful Cliff May ranch house outside of Dublin on a big horse stud, which was owned by the Tremaines, but they barely ever visited this place because over completing the Cliff May in Ireland, they then finally divorced. And once they had divorced, both moved out from the Tremaine house. So Warren Tremaine moved conveniently down the road, so to speak. They subdivided the property when they divorced, and they began selling off individual pieces of this huge piece of land. And Warren Tremaine moved into a house which was designed by Paul Gray, a partner in the Jack Warner and Paul Gray architecture office in Santa Barbara in Montecito. And Catherine Tremaine eventually moved away from Santa Barbara. She moved to Northern California, but then in the early 1970s came back to Santa Barbara. And then she asked Paul Lawrence Soderbergh, an architect and psychoanalyst, whom she had met at an anti-war demonstration outside of the Santa Barbara Art Museum on State Street. And she commissions him then to design a house in the Coyote Road area, which is up on the Riviera on the mountainside in Santa Barbara, facing the ocean. Paul Soderbergh, whom I had the pleasure to have many conversations with. He was, when he was already very much advanced in age, he passed away in 2017. He always told me that Catherine Tremaine was extremely precise in what she wanted for her house. And she said one question was, she didn't want to have a house which had any 90-degree angle. So she wanted a house with no 90-degree angle. She wanted a house where she had a bedroom where the sun would shine in her face in the morning rather than looking out into the northern direction into a beautiful meadow through this mitered glass corner window. She wanted fireplaces in her house, and she wanted her house to be sort of looking very organically with this house is clad with adobe bricks. The adobe bricks are not load-bearing masonry, but they're cladding masonry. So she didn't want to have the concrete, the glass, and everything. So it was almost like as if she had sort of a, how should we say this, sort of like an allergic reaction against sort of the aesthetics and architectural ideas, which obviously make out the Tremaine house as designed by Neutra. And she really wanted to have precisely the opposite house. And so Paul Soderbergh designed for her this very, very interesting sort of kind of Pueblo, Southwestern Pueblo style inspired architecture with sort of this sweeping, bowing sort of concrete roof, and then sort of placed in these adobe bricks. And you can see we don't have a rectangular swimming pool. We have some kind of irregular pond. We no longer have terrazzo surfaces. We have these little river pebbles with sort of larger, intermittent with larger stone slabs. And we don't have sort of concrete beams and concrete roof spandrels and everything. We just sort of have beams and then sort of this organic material laid over it. So the house is really completely, here's an early model photograph to give you a bit of an idea of the larger building. It is really, initially it appears to be the complete opposite of the Tremaine house, which Neutra had designed. Now, by that time in the early 1970s, Catherine Tremaine was clearly, or had clearly sort of completely reinvented herself as a wealthy philanthropist, and she was supporting many, many left-wing causes. I showed you earlier a photograph of her in apparently Nicaragua or somewhere nearby where there was this wall graphic of one of the members of the Sandinista Liberation Front. She was associated with counterculture. She got into channeling, into sort of alternative ideas of spirituality. And so this house really sort of matches this idea of Catherine Tremaine as sort of a very wealthy member of the counterculture movement, sort of in the late 60s, the early 1970s. And yet, when you actually look at other images of this house, and I'll show you them in a second, you can actually see that even this house is deeply, deeply in conversation with the Neutra house in a similar way, in a comparable way as the Neutra house was in a deep conversation with the von Romberg house of Burton and Emily Tremaine. So in the upper level, I have 3 photographs of interior and exterior views of Soderbergh's Catherine Tremaine house. And on the lower level, we have 3 corresponding images of Neutra's Warren and Catherine Tremaine house from the later 1940s. And let's start with, here is again the scene in the living room, once the fireplace wasn't built, with the daybed placed against this wood wall with the steel column marking where the entrance passage transitions into the open space of the living room. Here we can see, this is the moment where the spatial moment where you enter the living room area in Catherine Tremaine's new house, which has no 90-degree angle. The ceiling was actually a billowing ceiling, so there isn't even really a 90-degree angle in this corner here. But we have a daybed. You can just see it about here, underneath a painting of a young painter who was much younger than Catherine Tremaine, who was her partner. We should maybe describe this for a certain number of years. We have here a sideboard. Storage space in the Neutra house. We have a daybed in the Neutra house. We have the steel column in the Neutra house. We have a tree trunk in the Soderbergh Tremaine house. So I think we obviously have terrazzo here. We have here those terracotta tiles. So there are clear differences, and yet one has sort of feeling as if there's almost a kind of subconscious connection where a living room for Catherine Tremaine had to have a daybed, had to have a sideboard anchored in a vertical pillar. Here again, we have the bedroom with the mitered glass corner, and then this is Catherine Tremaine's bedroom in her 1970s house, where the sun sort of shines into her face in the morning. And then we have a real outdoor connection. You not just can see the outdoors through the mitered glass corner, but the Dutch door where you can even keep the upper part open overnight. And then, of course, here again, the raised terrace, which we remember was something Catherine Tremaine envisioned immediately when she was for the first time on the building site. And we have here again then a raised roof terrace on the house, which is a different, sort of somewhat differently architecturally conceived, but again gives her the opportunity to see the ocean from the distance. So I think, yes, Catherine Tremaine clearly wanted to leave the Neutra house behind her, and probably because the Neutra house, of course, was also sort of signified for her her marriage with Warren Tremaine, her life with Warren Tremaine. And yet, I think at the same time, she was so much sort of committed to this idea that a house is the personality of the owner, that she had to have her own house. This process of sort of reconceiving herself as a philanthropist associated with left-wing courses and with counterculture obviously wasn't complete until she built a house. And once she got into building a house, you then actually realize that she never leaves the Neutra house behind her. She writes 2 volumes of autobiography, and in one volume, she writes a lot about how she dreamt about building a house, this Soderbergh house. But in the same text, she also remembers how she went to the building site of the Tremaine house. And it's very interesting. She describes the construction of the Tremaine house. The one thing she vividly remembers is the stonemasons sort of working on the surface of the exposed concrete, which is not smooth, but it is sort of has been made over, it has been chiseled away on the surface so that it is a certain roughness in that surface. And she describes this stonemasons sitting on that site, building site, and chipping away on these concrete surfaces. And she describes this as if she is sort of back in ancient Israel with sort of a quasi-religious overtone. So this Tremaine house, the design, the construction, the commissioning of the Tremaine house clearly was something which she was very much committed to. The very last sort of observation, when you read the obituaries for Kit Tremaine, she then called her Kit Tremaine in this second or in this last phase of her life. When you read these obituaries, many details about her past and so on are reported in these obituaries. But when she passes away, the knowledge that she was one of the 2, Warren and Catherine Tremaine, who had commissioned one of the most famous Neutra houses, which Neutra could ever build, mid-20th century houses, has totally disappeared. I have not seen a single obituary which actually even in a small sentence points out that she was one of the couple who commissioned this famous Neutra house. So she really managed to totally sort of make her old life sort of really disappear or not being known, publicly aware in public life. So that's the story, or some aspects of the story of the Tremaine house, which your father designed. And as I said, which fascinated me ages ago in Berlin. And I'm really happy that eventually I got around to figure out this history. And then it became a much more fascinating and complex history than I initially had imagined.
Thank you so much, Volker. This is so valuable, and I've learned new things too. I visited this place as a teenager in the mid 50s, probably. Maybe they were just gone for the weekend. I had a feeling that that they had gone and invited us to be there. I wanted to make an additional comment. So if you unshare your screen and let me share mine here, I'm going to, yeah. So the Gloriette that was designed in 1945 for the top of the building there. And by the way, you represented the commission that my father already had a design in January of 45. And I think that he was also doing preliminary drawings for the Kaufmann House. So that they're going at the same time, but Kaufmann gets completed more or less on schedule, and the Tremaine House drags on until 48, even though it may have actually begun to be designed before the Kaufmann. So you pointed out that my father as a kid would have walked in the Schönbrunn garden and seen this Gloriette and known that word. And the first rooftop garden that he designed was on the Neutra VDL studio and residences, which you got through a ladder that went half a floor up, and then another ladder that ended up in this open cockpit. And then you had flower boxes and slats, and my mother and brother Dion are represented looking out, not over the estate, but rather on the Los Angeles Power and Water Reservoir, which we are borrowing in the good Japanese manner. But it turns out that this was rarely used because it was just too much sun. I used to go up there with my friends, and sometimes we would throw things down on the cars going by. But other than that, it was not much used. And my parents would have been slept in these sleeping porches on the top of the 1922 Schindler House, which also had intimate views. And Le Corbusier fell in love with the flat roofs of the Mediterranean villages where people would dry food and clothes, and when tourists came, then they would lounge up there. And so the Villa Savoy has a sun roof there. And 8 years earlier at Pezac, the workers had rooftop gardens, partly covered and partly open. In 1932, the same year as VDL, this little house for the groundsman at the Werkbundsiedlung was built, and it too had these stairs going to a flat roof. The great-grandson of the groundskeeper told me that they never go up there because it's too sunny. And the same complaint is made here in the 1935 a Beard House, which has stairway going up to a flat roof that doesn't get used because it's too sunny. So by the time that the Tremaine and Kaufmann houses are shown, you have a Gloriette, one at the Tremaines, which would have been mostly for Kit, this one being a general socializing area. And you have partly covered, partly open. You have these metal louvers borrowed from Hardoy and his partner in Buenos Aires at the Virrey de Pinos apartment house, where they had these vertical louvers. But these are a little different in that they're metal and that they lock against the wind. Mm-hmm. And when it came time to rebuild the Neutra VDL studio residence, once again, lessons were learned. My brother and father designed an enclosed part of that roof with a stairway rather than a ladder, and even a little elevator. And this has become a very successfully used part of the house for intimate meetings where people sit on the floor and they lean against this bolster that's built into the structural steel there, or there are parties. So you can see that the Tremaine house roof treatment was part of a generally improving approach to using roofs for views and intimate experiences. So, Volker, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And this is a real contribution to the understanding of that important house. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad that we had an opportunity to have a little conversation about this. And I'm happy that I could help you out with this and that I could add at least a few new details.
Great. Thank you
Great. Thank you
so
very much. You take care. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.